Yeah, good morning, everyone. We are starting our webinar today, talking about the report on the human rights abuses in Uganda. And we're going to focus on the use of torture by the government of Uganda. And this report was released yesterday, and it contains information about, testimonies from victims of torture, people who were tortured by the government of Uganda, the military, the police. Also, it contains the analysis on the involvement or inaction of the international community. It has a lot of information about, what can be done next. And basically, we also thanking everyone who is fighting for democracy in Uganda, but also everywhere in Africa and in the world. So without further ado, we have panelists here. We have Chloe, who is a consultant at Task International. She was very instrumental in putting together this report. Myself, I'm Leonce Byimana, I'm the Executive Director of Task International. We have Jeffrey Smith, who is the Executive Director of Vanguard Africa. He's a vocal advocate of democracy and human rights all over the world, but he is also focused on Uganda a lot. We have Oriem Nyeko, who is the main researcher of Human Rights Watch in Uganda, and he's also going to be talking to us. We have Nana, who has contributed to the report, but who is also an advocate for human rights and also justice for survivors of torture and other human rights abuses. The same with William, who is also joining us. Welcome, William. I know you're having a problem with internet, but we are looking forward to hear from you as well. So I'm going to give the mic to Chloe. She's going to tell us how this report came together and who she interviewed, and we'll take it from there. And thank you for all the attendees. This is also going to be live on Facebook. At the end of this conversation as well, I'm going to share the link to the full report. It's a almost 90 pages report with testimonies and analysis, so that you can read it on your own. Again, thank you so much, Chloe.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chloe. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, like Leon said, for the past 3 months, a team at Task and myself have been researching the human rights situation in Uganda and the use of torture and violence that surrounded their most recent 2020 presidential election that happened in January. And during this time, I conducted over 20 interviews with torture survivors. We also received 325 reports of human rights abuses from Ugandan citizens. And these abuses included the use of torture, enforced disappearances, beatings, and extrajudicial killings. The demographics of these survivors that I interviewed very much varied. The age range was between 25 and 70 years old. The 70-year-old survivor that I spoke with said that it pained him to see the use of torture and violence only increase throughout his lifetime, as he now sees people being killed as if they were insects in Uganda. The source is now currently unable to live in Uganda as he's afraid of the persecution he would face should he return, but he still hopes that Uganda may change for the better, as he's now 70 years old, tired, and more than ready to see his old home again before his life ends. I talked with both men and women, those who belong to opposition parties such as National Unity Platform and the Forum for Democratic Change. I also talked with those who are not involved in politics at all prior to their torture experience, and some who were extremely involved and worked directly with the oppositional presidential candidate, Bobi Wine, on the campaign trail. Those who continue to support the political opposition and presidential candidate have expressed that the government is currently, as we speak, trying to hunt down all who participated on the campaign trail. One source quotes that, "I'm worried I'm going to die every day. Whenever I leave the house, I do not know if that is the last day I will talk to my family." The professions of the individuals that I interviewed were also quite diverse and included, but are not limited to businessmen, journalism, university students, and those who are involved in academia. The majority of the people I spoke with were tortured within the last 5 years, besides for a few who were either tortured by the Museveni regime in the 90s or early 2000s, very much demonstrating the long and tragic history of torture in Uganda. Many of these survivors were or currently are in hiding and fear future detainment as they consistently face persecution, threats, and violence from the Ugandan government for speaking out against the right violations they both experienced and witnessed. One of the survivors I interviewed is currently in prison, and reports indicate that he's being tortured again. He is one of many who have been taken, as other reports suggest that hundreds of NUP supporters are missing due to their support of the political opposition. In addition to persecution, survivors also deal with the significant physical and psychological impact of their torture experiences. For example, the mother of a torture survivor that I spoke with said her daughter has been terribly weak since her torture experience and experiences chronic pain in her head and back. Psychologically, the mother said she falls back to the room where she was tortured and she returns to reality with her mother. She says, "Mommy, I came back from the dark room and I see people stomping on me again." Overall, it was an honor to hear the stories of these survivors, two of which are joining us today, Nana and Chiomia. The bravery and resiliency of each of those I interviewed was evident in each case. I'm pleased that TASK was able to incorporate these interviews into the report, Torture in Uganda, the Tragic History, Impact, and Current Reality under the Museveni regime, that covers the history of torture and specifically the use of torture in these last 5 years, highlighting the police violence at public events, the torture that occurs in detention, the exploitation of COVID-19 pandemic restrictions to oppress citizens, as well as a section on the continuing violence against marginalized communities. This report also covers the people who perpetuate the use of torture, the impact of torture on victims, and the response of the international community thus far to the human rights situation in Uganda. I'm happy that the voices of those who survived the use of torture may be heard in this report and are no longer being silenced. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for an overview of how we came up with this report and type of people you interviewed. Then I'll pass the mic to Oriem, who is for working for Human Rights Watch. Thank you for your work with Human Rights Watch. A lot of reports on human rights abuses in Uganda. We really rely on you on fresh information from the country. So Oriem, please, the mic is yours.
Thanks so much, Leonce. I want to thank TASK, as well as you and Chloe for the report that you put out. It's extremely detailed, and I think it's going to be hugely useful for a lot of people that want to understand the extent to which torture has been used by the state in Uganda as a means of repression. I was asked to talk about the status of human rights in Uganda over the course of the last year. And I thought about it, and I felt it was a difficult task because obviously 2020 was a very unique year. And at the same time, it was a very ordinary year as far as human rights abuses are concerned. So it's difficult at times to frame the abuses in terms of what took place without referencing COVID and the uniqueness that that brought about. But I do think that what we saw in the past year, up until I would say the beginning of this year with the elections, were very emblematic of Uganda's larger human rights problems, which for me have been characterized by a cycle of two things that typically take place in Uganda in a given period of time, which involves human rights abuses and impunity. It's something that happens continuously and frequently and has happened over the course of several years, not just last year. And even though the human rights situation last year was clothed in a new identity with COVID, it ultimately was very familiar. So I just wanted to talk about that cycle because there's a couple of things that typically take place in Uganda, as far as human rights are concerned. And this happened again last year, in the past year. So the first thing sort of that I identified as I thought about this was oftentimes there's hostile rhetoric around human rights issues by officials. Government officials will say horrendous things about that affect or deal with human rights issues. So for example, I apologize, my phone is ringing. If you mind, let me just mute that for 1 second. I'm back. Apologies once again. So I was talking about the hostile rhetoric around human rights issues. The first example that I had of this taking place was of the police chief who famously told journalists during a press conference ahead of the elections in January that they, the police, shall beat you for your own sake to help you to understand that you shouldn't go there. And that is to cover elections or opposition-related rallies. Similarly, in March last year, the RDC, the Resident District Commissioner, who is a representative of the president in the northern Ugandan village, district of Amuru, threatened to beat people who congregated in public spaces. Now, these are outrageous things that these high-level officials are saying, but they, for some reason, they feel emboldened to threaten to beat journalists or members of the public. And there's a particular reason for that. And I think that has to do with the cycle of abuses and impunity that have continued to take place, which I will continue to elaborate on. So after these officials say these things publicly and are not held accountable for them, the abuses will take place. So for example, in the past year, there were two sort of main incidents that were key. One, the enforcement of the COVID-19 restrictions, where we saw the security forces beating and in some cases extorting and arresting people for failing to comply with these rules about how many people should congregate in a particular place or not. That happened in many different parts of the country since March of last year and culminated during the elections where COVID-19 was really used as an excuse for the security forces to commit those abuses. And similarly, during the actual elections, the security forces arrested scores of people, including presidential candidates. We heard about the numerous times in which Bobi Wine was arrested, as well as the other presidential candidates during the election period, as well as the violent clampdown on protesters during the protests in mid-November last year. So those abuses take place, and usually that's followed by outrage and media coverage. People call for change. Organizations like ours document these abuses and we draw attention to them as much as possible, which oftentimes is followed by clampdowns by the government. So for example, last year, we saw the security forces beat journalists and block the media from accessing or presenting information about these different abuses that have taken place. Even during the elections, the government preempted that approach by days. Usually of some sort. So for example, in February this year, after the military beat journalists covering Bobi Wine delivering his petition to UN human rights in Kampala and Kololo, the military actually apologized. They issued an apology for the beatings and announced that they were going to severely reprimand and try the soldiers that had been involved in those beatings, and announced that they had convicted them. This was, I mean, obviously we, as civil society, we constantly call for criminal procedures, but it was questionable in that the military didn't involve any of the victims in that process, didn't call them as witnesses. They said that they actually hadn't been informed and were actually surprised to hear about that announcement. Similarly, during the lockdown, after the military, after soldiers and local defense unit members beat people for not complying with the COVID-19 restrictions, the military also announced, also apologized to individuals, but the process was opaque. And so after the apologies and the relative accountability, everything is forgotten, so to speak. The discussion is removed from the public sphere, and then the cycle will continue. And so those things, a lot of the examples that I gave took place in the past year. They are likely to continue again this year in a similar fashion. We will hear the hostile rhetoric from government officials. We'll see the abuses take place. We'll see people become outraged about them. And then the acknowledgement in some cases non-acknowledgement. And then we'll forget about it. And then it will continue once again. And I think what I recognize about this cycle, this continuous cycle, this wheel turning over and over again, is that something more needs to be done. We need, for one, to move beyond, from our perspective as civil society and media and activists who are very interested in human rights issues, to move beyond rhetoric, to move beyond having singular conversations about these things. We need to continue to put pressure on the government and to continually scrutinize its actions. For example, if the military announces that it is trying individuals, we need to question whether fair trial processes have been followed, and whether it has, the legal system in place in Uganda has been enforced. I think the international community in particular has a very important obligation in order to ensure that they don't continue to support these abuses. We've obviously heard about the United States and its remarks about visa restrictions towards government officials. That's important because it demonstrates that the United States is not willing to continually support those kinds of abuses and will take steps to ensure that people are responsible for them do not continue to perpetrate them. And finally, it's important for us to continue to reinforce and speak continuously about the obligations of Uganda under Ugandan law and under international law. So those are my remarks in regards to the human rights situation in Uganda.
Thank you so much, Oriem, for your very powerful contribution. Now, Jeff, you can take the floor.
Great. Thanks so much, Leonce and Task, for organizing today's event. Really appreciate it. I was asked to speak on the issue of Ugandan youth engagement and the ongoing struggle for democracy and human rights, but also the Ugandan government's violent response. I think most of us here today and most listening know that Uganda is largely believed to be the youngest population in the world. I think according to the latest data, 77% of its population, in fact, is under the age of 25. And if you do the math, which I'm not very good at, but this equates to about 27 million people. And when you start to look at the numbers and break that down further, this means that there are roughly 7 million youth, likely a bit more from the ages of 15 to 24, who are currently living in the country. Now, the problem is that upwards of 70% of these young citizens are old enough to work, but they are unemployed, right? So they lack prospects and they lack hope for a better future. At the same time, interestingly, you have roughly half of all Ugandans, about 46%, depending on which data you're looking at, who are connected to the internet. And this is actually a pretty high percentage for the region, and it's 52nd in the world, in fact. So taken together, it's really interesting. You have this mixture of of issues. You have an already large, expanding, and increasingly restless and frustrated population of young people who have access to information and who have never known another leader aside from General Museveni, who we of course know has been in power since 1986. They're connected to the internet, which means they understand what is happening around them, what is happening in the world. They follow elections in Africa and worldwide, and they begin to wonder, of course, why change hasn't come to Uganda. What is preventing this change? So in effect, the way in which I look at it, and surely many others, you have this growing critical mass, right, of young people in Uganda that are standing up now and have been for generations, demanding their rights. And interestingly, if you look at the other data that's out there from Afrobarometer and other polling agencies, 8 out of 10 Ugandans, so 80%, prefer democracy and multi-party elections as opposed to one party or military rule, which is all they've experienced. And I have to imagine that 80% figure is even much higher among today's young population in Uganda. And these are the very same young people who have stood up over the past several years, often, as we have seen, certainly this year and in late 2020, really going out into the streets, putting their lives on the line to do so, to support that country's pro-democracy movement led by Bobi Wine, the National Unity Platform, and other courageous leaders. An interesting side note here, and I'll sort of explain why I go into this a bit later, but there's only one other country in sub-Saharan Africa today that has a higher percentage of young people between the ages of 18 and 35, and that's Malawi in Southern Africa. And Malawi has seen routine changes of power, including recently at the presidency level, as recently as last year, when the pro-democracy opposition united to unseat an increasingly, what many people saw and many Malawians saw as an increasingly authoritarian incumbent president. Interestingly, too, according to Freedom House, an organization that I worked at for a number of years, Malawi was the only country in the world where democracy actually improved during the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other hand, 80 countries declined, often drastically, and that included Uganda. So this is the scenario, right? Namely, democratic change, reform at the highest levels, government accountability. This is what General Museveni and Ugandan authorities have tried so hard to prevent and to violently suppress. They've seen what has happened in Malawi when youth are empowered, when the opposition is allowed to actively campaign and bring out the vote and defend that vote. So we saw a number of measures in the lead up to the election-like event we saw in January. They prevented participation through violence, but they also did it in very clever nonviolent means, which is the very hallmarks of modern authoritarianism, of which Museveni is at the forefront. For instance, Uganda's Electoral Commission, as we know, declined to pursue an extended voter registration period aimed specifically at first-time voters, at the youth. And this was even requested. This move was requested by a number of members of the Ugandan parliament. And by refusing to do so, that meant that well over 1 million Ugandans who had reached the age of enfranchisement when the sham election occurred in January, they were unable to express their will at the ballot box. So, it really makes one wonder. It makes me wonder, why is the country's largest voting bloc not a sufficient priority for election officials and for Ugandan authorities? And obviously, I think one of the key elements or the key answers to that is that Bobi Wine specifically and the NUP effectively tapped into. They really did effectively tap into Uganda's youth population, both their valid grievances and criticisms of government policies, but also their lingering hopes for a better future. And that's why I think this time around, you heard Oriam talking about this tradition and this cycle of impunity and violence. But I think, and I could be wrong, and I'd be interested to hear others' viewpoints on this. I think perhaps this time around was the most violent election in Uganda's history, certainly its recent history. So of course, again, as Oriam, expertly went into, while harassing opposition politicians has become a tradition in Uganda, I think the fact that Bobi Wine, again, for instance, represents a new generational challenge to an aging autocrat, that's why you saw this very robust and forceful response from the authorities. And I think this is why, of course, authorities repeatedly arrested him and his supporters, prevented him from holding public meetings. They intervened repeatedly to stop journalists from covering him. One personal experience I had was, on January 7 of this year, we held a live press conference with several of my colleagues and with Bobi Wine in Uganda, in which we were unveiling a legal complaint filed at the International Criminal Court against Ugandan authorities. And during this live press conference, in which we had dozens of journalists around the world, some of whom may be listening today, they'll remember, he was pulled from his vehicle forcefully. His video went black. We heard gunshots going off. We heard, what appeared to be a struggle happening. And ultimately, Bobby came back on camera and, very clearly he had been pepper sprayed. He was coughing. He couldn't breathe. But the fact that that happened with literally the world watching, I think really made people start to wonder, what's happening when the cameras aren't rolling, what's happening behind the scenes here. And if they can do that to someone so high profile as a leading opposition candidate for president, live on the air with major media watching, what else could be happening here? So I think by preventing Uganda's youth from voting and participating in civic life, the key issue here is that, in essence, the future of Uganda is not being charted by those who actually live with the consequences that are being made by today's leaders, right? And of course, I think to wrap up, I think it's really important to know, obviously, that repression in Uganda extends well beyond the youth population. In March of this year, for instance, at Vanguard Africa, our colleagues and I released a comprehensive report similar to the report at Task that focused specifically on abductions and human rights violations in Uganda, which tracked these cases in the lead up to, during it, and in the immediate aftermath of the election-like event we saw in January. So this report, it's available on our website, and I can certainly send around the link. The report only includes documented and fully verified evidence. So the overall numbers of abductions and killings are likely much higher. However, we did uncover some very startling figures. For instance, 423 people confirmed abducted by the state again, and unsurprisingly, many of them affiliated, perceived, or otherwise with the opposition. These are volunteers, these are supporters, these are campaigners. 158 were abducted and brought to military court. So they're not even being treated as civilians. They're being treated as military enemy combatants. They're being treated in a way in which they're enemies of the state, right? They're not even being accorded the rights of a citizen. They're not even being accorded the rights that are enshrined in Uganda's own constitution, that are enshrined in regional continental conventions to which Uganda is a signatory. And overall, we documented 31 people murdered in the lead up to and during the election. Again, the numbers are certainly much higher, but these were the ones we were able to confirm. So I think, in sum, democracy in Africa, in Uganda, certainly worldwide, even here in the United States, as we know fully well, faces many mounting obstacles. But one way in which to make it thrive and to make a comeback on the continent and in Uganda specifically, I think, is to work urgently to reduce the barriers to young people's participation. And if that isn't done, then these complex issues of mistrust, of exclusion, of increasing marginalization that we're seeing, these elements that are so detrimental to peace and stability and human development in the long run, these are only going to worsen in Uganda moving forward. And that's why I think conversations like these are so important. So again, thanks to Task for organizing. And I think it's also an indication, and Oria mentioned this as well, that talking about these issues, doing advocacy, getting more people involved, speaking to different constituencies, speaking to decision makers is so important. And I think that the visa restrictions that were placed on Ugandan officials by the US government last week are an important indicator of that, and why it's so important to keep these conversations alive, keep the spotlight on. As we all know, dictators like General Museveni grow strength in the darkness. They become more emboldened in the shadows. And I think with events like this and continued advocacy, the more light we can shine on this situation, the better it will be moving forward. We just have to keep it up. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate your intervention. I also wanted to mention that one of the attendees was asking, why did we cover only Bobi Wine? We didn't cover only Bobi Wine. Again, as Chloe mentioned, in the introduction, this report is not based on a political party or any faction. This report is only looking at human rights abuses, especially torture, regardless who was the victims. Most of the people who provided their testimonies are not even part of a political party. But also wanted to mention that in the process of getting this report together, we received more than 400 reports from individuals in Uganda. We have 400 reports with names and how they were tortured, but we're not able to interview all of them. But probably we'll do another exercise to interview more people, but this is how we came up with this report. So any type of human rights abuse, any type of torture, we're going to make sure that it is reported. At the same time, we need help from citizens to report those abuses so that we could use those to inform the decision makers, policy makers internationally. I don't know if people are going to get justice in Uganda, but many people are working hard to get people who are torturing citizens to be held accountable. So from that, I will invite Nana. And Nana, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and share your story. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Greetings again. I am Nana Mwafrika, a human rights defender based in my country, Uganda, Kampala to be specific. Even though the times find me up and it will be known that against dissidents in Uganda is done very smoothly. It's done very torture and abuse, all the abuse in Uganda is done very, very quietly. You have government thugs, I will call them thugs, calling journalists, they give them morning calls away with the ugliest of stories, dirtiest stories that would taint Museveni's picture internationally. In Uganda and all the violation of human rights is being enabled too much by countries in the West, respected and believed in a man who clearly has just taken them for a ride for the longest time. Museveni's involvement, sorry, I have a little baby in this live, but General Museveni's involvement in the conflicts all over this region, say Sudan, South Sudan now, Rwanda, Congo, Somalia, all neighboring situations that happen, he is there. His eye is there, his involvement is there. And then the West views him as the savior, as the man to trust with $1 million, as a man to trust with all the support to his military, to his police. He's the one that ships off police support and military support to every other place that has got security issues. He does that while the actual insecurity and terror that America's policy on Africa seems to really concentrate on, the actual terror is being born at home. As he sends off troops to, say, Somalia or wherever, the safety with the people, with the Ugandan people within country, it cannot be relied upon. The picture that he puts on This is General Yoweri Museveni, who for me as a human rights defender have studied to see that is the biggest perpetrator, the commander-in-chief. He's called the commander-in-chief of the army and other security organs that have meted all this pain on Ugandans. So he being the one that commands this, you know, he has a smooth way around him. He will put on civilian attire, put on that floppy hat, and and really show he's the darling of the East African region. He is the darling of Africa, the only trusted, you know, he has got a lot of accolades over the years. Though we, the local people, the local Ugandans, the people at home, do not see where these accolades come from all the time. There has been total clampdown on free speech. Journalists have been beaten, like one of my colleagues already said. A whole inspector general police, the head of police, will stand and in front of cameras inform and tell the country or the world that you know, we will be beating journalists. I speak as a rights defender, but also a survivor of torture, a survivor of police brutality. A lot of cruelty was meted on me in 2019. That's April, even when I had a prior arrangement to reach the Inspector General Police. I had been there the day before. I had been given the time to come and meet the Inspector General Police over matters of human rights violations that were escalating at the time. They deployed for me, a woman without any weapon, a woman without any threat. I wasn't in any shape to run or fight anyone. In fact, I was heavily expectant of a child. The things that happened to me, you covered partly, you covered in the recent interview. So for me, I think that this naive or maybe little informed trust that the West, especially America, has had in General Museveni, has earned General Museveni tons of money. Money he's free to, you know, use for his classified budget, all the monies that come in. If his money is intended to pay, you know, for healthcare, education, and other public services, it all gets channeled to what he calls security with near impunity. There is nobody that's supposed to ask about that. And for me, I think that his continued picture, putting on the angel picture, the angelic picture. Look, guys, I am the savior of the region. I am the smart one. This has earned him substantial amounts of military support and other assistance, and as well as, you know, near total impunity. Because when the things are done, as we, the local people, report them, and I've already told you there is a challenge of the local media being totally, it's either compromised or intimidated out of reporting the actual cases, the gravest of cases of torture and rights abuse. So a lot of it remains in the dark. A lot of it remains unreported or just partially reported or very heavily edited. So for me, I do think that if there can be a revision on this policy that America has on Africa and particularly Uganda, to see General Museveni as the man he is, the man that just enjoys chaos and that just enjoys to be seen as a savior, but he's no savior in any case. He is a perpetuator of a lot of the things that are happening in this region. Like I told you, call for any involvement, his involvement all over the region, all over the countries that have had issues, the Congo, everywhere where there is these mean interests and war, he is there. Everywhere, Museveni is there. The decades that have been wasted on trusting him, funding him heavily, have caused Uganda a lot of pain, and Ugandans are now living in almost total fear. They are totally frightened to even be seen crying about the pain meted onto them by the militarized police and security personnel of Uganda. So for me, I would think that the sanctions that were announced very recently by America against Ugandan officials involved in all these human rights violations should really come to materialize. They should be followed by a total defunding. America must defund the security agencies, the security bodies of Uganda. They call themselves security, but all they met on their people locally. Uganda is meting untold suffering on her people. The evidence is within the most recent election, the January 14th election. It has left a lot of Ugandans fleeing to nearby countries. Even prior to the election, many Ugandans are in refugee camps in Kenya. They are running off the youth instead of being home to get empowered and take Uganda forward. They find themselves being forced, to be shipped off to the Middle East to do domestic work over there, because all the money that should have planned for their empowerment has been used by Museveni in his, General Museveni in his, this famous classified, they call it classified budgets. Money comes in, it's supposed to be for COVID management. Before you know it, 3/4 of all of it is going to classified budget for Museveni, and they call it security. It's going to the security forces. It's very hard to understand for the common Ugandan how a country, a nation that should be built on, shared expectations, where the law should be followed, where killers should be punished, where perpetrators of all these violations should be punished and taken to courts of law and to be held accountable. These men are just rewarded with promotions. The 2016 massacre in Kasese, that's southwestern Uganda, where a small kingdom, an entire village, a kingdom was bombed, chickens, goats, little girls, boys, women. They showed other women survivors that were stripped naked and tied in chains and taken to prisons. A lot of those people were just, released, they said, around a few weeks to the last election. Of course, that was his way also to buy the angry people of Kasese back to maybe vote him. But when this 2016 attack on the kingship of the Rwenzururu happened, instead of punishing the man that commanded it, the army man called General Ereru, he instantly got a promotion. He got promotions, he got more stars on his badge, and then it leaves you totally confused at how does America see these things? How does the taxpayers' money, the ordinary American that pays taxes, which end up coming to Uganda as donor funding, as funding for this and that, but it all winds up being used by one man to just, stand firm and plant firm his dictatorship and his authoritarian regime some more. Torture and abuse in Uganda is going to continue if America does not take a stand firm and go, a firm stand, and go past the, talking the sanctions and do the sanctions, disable these perpetrators and abusers from transacting in America. The money sent here from Europe and wherever in the West to support, education and eliminate disease and healthcare and whatever, it is used against Ugandans by, buying cameras to spy on human rights defenders, buying torture vans. There is a a van currently that's called the drone, the infamous Toyota vans that have been used over the past few months to pick up youth from their work, to pick up youths from their homes and take them to torture chambers, make them disappear or take them to prisons. Instead of such money, continued pouring of money in this pit that Museveni calls developing the region, they should just defund him completely.
Thank you so much, Nana. I appreciate the intervention. Thank you for sharing your story as well. Your story is detailed in the report. A very strong story. But we have William now. William, can you hear me? William is also a torture survivor in Uganda. William, can you hear me? William, are you there? Yeah, William seems to be experiencing technical issues. But I wanted to mention that, we really applaud torture survivors in Uganda, people who came forward and shared their stories. That's how the world is going to see what is happening, because the government of Uganda, as many other governments in Africa, they have very strong PR. They have very strong PR companies helping them to sell a good image that they don't even have. So it's only by having survivors like Nana, like William, and many others who I can see in our as attendees today, who came forward and shared their stories. That is really, really powerful. I think, as Chloe mentioned, she interviewed more than 20 people, but we received reports from more than 400 people. As William figure out technology, if you have a question, please write it in the question tab. But also I have added in the chat the link to the report. We have a few questions here. How do we interpret the involvement of the civilian youth in perpetrating violence? Maybe one of the panelists could take that question. My name is Olive. What can anyone do, or what can the United Nations do to control the abuses and torture in Uganda? I have been a victim of this myself, and my family has. Dr. Stella, good to see you on the as an attendee. Doesn't America support Museveni violence and torture because he fight their wars against terror in Somalia, Congo, and South Sudan? Why cancel the visas, yet America continues funding his arms? Well, I think Nana also mentioned this. I think we're going to have someone maybe talk about this. Yeah. So these are the questions that we have. Does any of the speaker have a feedback on these two questions? How can we interpret the involvement of civilian youth in perpetrating violence? And the other question, what can the United Nations do? And the third question, why the visa sanctions while the West continue to support Museveni in different activities?
Could I say something in response to the question about youth and escalating violence? I assume that question stems from this idea, this notion that has sort of been presented, that young people, especially during protests, have been very violent and have sort of provoked the security forces into committing some of the abuses that they have been responsible for. So for example, during the protest in November, when people came out onto the streets to protest against Bobi Wine's arrest for supposedly not complying with COVID regulations, people might say that therefore that provoked the security forces into shooting people and killing them. I think the response to that is, first of all, the right to protest exists. It's law in the Constitution in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. That is entirely legitimate. People are entitled to go out onto the streets to express their dissatisfaction with what is going on. But in the event that individuals are violent or are disruptive, the state is obviously entitled to take action against them, but it should be proportional to what is taking place. And if any force that is the security forces use, it should be used as a means to de-escalate the violence, not to kill protesters. So what took place in November, for example, when according to the official reports, over 54 people died over the course of violence on 2 days, that should never have happened. The security forces should have taken steps to de-escalate the violence that was taking place rather than to themselves continually reinforce it. I think that that's very important to continue to reiterate the obligations of the state and the security forces, which is to prevent violence from taking place and not to perform it.
Thank you so much, Oriam, for your feedback. On the question of the US continuing to support Museveni because of what he's doing in Somalia, I'm inviting Andrea, who wrote this section on the international support of Museveni. Andrea, do you want to take 2 minutes to talk about that question? You are muted, Andrea.
Yeah, so we were very encouraged by the visa sanctions applied against Ugandan officials, but we need to go much, much further. And there's absolutely no question that one of the reasons the United States continues supporting Museveni is because of the contribution of Ugandan troops in AMISOM fighting al-Shabaab in Somalia. As many people know, Uganda contributes almost 1/3 of the 22,000 troops in AMISOM, and they're supposed to be very effective troops. And my understanding is even though the mandate for AMISOM is supposed to end at the end of 2021, that will not happen. It will probably continue. I just want to take another minute to say, in 2014, Uganda was still contributing a lot of troops to AMISOM. Nothing was any different. But that's when Uganda passed the Anti-Homosexuality Act in 2014. And after that happened, very quickly, this is what happened. The Defense Department, this is all in my report, in my section on US policy in the TASS report. The Defense Department canceled an aviation exercise with Uganda. They also imposed visa sanctions. They also decided to cancel a $3 million they were going to use for a National Public Health Institute to another African country. And they also canceled a $2.4 million community policing program for Uganda. Now that's small amounts of money, but that goes beyond just applying visa sanctions. And during that time, we still had Ugandan troops in AMISOM. So I think it's important now that the United States can at least take some additional actions in the security assistance or in other kinds of programs, redirecting money that it gives to the Ministry of Health, to NGOs working on health. It can still do that now and at least live up to the measures that it took in 2014 when Uganda passed the Anti-Homosexuality Act. And people should take a look at the letter written by Senator Cory Booker and also the one by Senator James Risch about suggestions that they are making, what they would like the State Department to do now following the elections in Uganda.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We have only 4 minutes. Do you want to go give our panelists 1 minute each for a closing remark. Jeff, I can start by Jeff.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Leonce. Thanks, Andrea, for that great summary of your section of the report. Given that I only have 1 minute, I would just say that I think U.S. support for what is essentially a military dictatorship in Uganda is unfortunately not an isolated incident, isolated case. Unfortunately, going back generations under both Republican and Democratic administrations here, there's been this very flawed, entirely counterproductive, backward notion of this benevolent dictator, right? That this authoritarian, this strong man, which is a misnomer in itself, that can bring stability and development to a country for so long. The Meles EPRDF regime in Ethiopia and Paul Kagame and the RPF in Rwanda are sort of put forward as exemplars of this. And of course, we've seen what has happened in Ethiopia, and we've seen the myriad human rights abuses and killings and disappearances and torture and extrajudicial executions and the decimation of civil society and any semblance of political opposition in Rwanda. But again, if you look at Central Africa, Cameroon, and Paul Biya, who's been in power since 1982, Obiang, who's been in power since 1979, all the way across to East Africa. We've been talking about Uganda today, of course, but Djibouti, Omar Gele, who just won a sham election, who's been in power since 1999. We've seen what has happened in Chad with the events of this week. So I think this backward notion of this benevolent dictator who brings stability and brings development to his country is completely flawed. It's not based in fact. And I think on Uganda specifically, just really quickly to wrap up, I think there are a number of more steps that need to be taken. I think President Biden and his team should immediately launch a comprehensive and very prominently publicized review of all financial assistance to Uganda. I think any humanitarian programs carried out by the Ugandan government should be redirected to third-party implementers, ideally local civil society groups, given the inherent corruption and lack of transparency and opaqueness within the Museveni regime. I think doing this would ensure a continuity of service to the Ugandan people who actually deserve it. I think programs that solely benefit the government of Uganda, especially military and security assistance, should be suspended immediately until this review is complete. And second, as we saw with the visa restrictions, and we've seen some local reporting of Museveni's response to this, only personal repercussions are likely to spur him and the government toward needed reform. So in addition to visa restrictions, more needs to be done there. I think any assets, for instance, held in the US or elsewhere that belong to Museveni in his inner circle or his family members, these should be frozen immediately on human rights and corruption grounds, full stop. And lastly, I think, that the Biden administration can and should recall its ambassador, publicly do so. Recall the ambassador to Washington for consultations while this comprehensive review is being undertaken and finalized. I think those are very feasible steps that can and should be taken in the near future, and that's something we'll certainly be advocating for privately and certainly publicly through our advocacy.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you for Vanguard Africa for the work you're doing in Uganda. And Nana, you want to take 1 minute, just 1 minute quickly, and conclude?
All right. Thank you for the 1 minute. For me, I would repeat: defund General Museveni's system, defund his police, defund his military. They are doing us more harm than good. Defund them, period. Chase them. Do not let them transact with the good people of America. They send their children over there to give, their daughters to give birth. They send their children to the finest hospitals in America and in Europe and in India while leaving the bare minimum at home. Defund them. Do not let them come in. Let them stay home and enjoy what for them they think is the good thing that they are doing for Uganda. There is this problem already.
Yeah, I think Nana has
their response to the actions, back and said, one official said, what does he need to come and do in America?
Thank you, Nana. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. I hope we will stay in touch with you and your work. Andrea, quickly, 1 minute.
Yeah, I would just like to take my 1 minute to talk about what Senator Cory Booker talked about. I think the most important thing that he said is that he is asking for some of the things that Jeffrey Smith just talked about, which is an assessment, a detailed list of all US security assistance that we're providing to Uganda since 2015. We actually do not have such a list. So I see step one would be some transparency in exactly the kind of security assistance that the United States provides to Uganda. And so there people can look at that very, very, very closely. And also, I think it's very important that we also look at whether or not the United States trains and equips the Ugandan forces in AMISOM. And one of the things that Senator Booker is talking about and Senator Risch is we have to see if any of the military aid that the United States is giving to Uganda for AMISOM is being used to, quote, divert and suppress dissent within Uganda. That is a letter from 2 leading senators. So we have to build on that and try to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Oriam?
Okay, well, I think I'll sort of take another perspective. Much of the conversation has been about this idea of other people taking action against Uganda, which ideally should be a deterrent to the Ugandan government to basically stop perpetuating human rights abuses. So obligations of the Ugandan government to respect human rights and to enforce the myriad of laws and policies that exist within our legal ecosystem to protect human rights. It's hugely important that the Ugandan government fulfills its obligations, both nationally and internationally. Otherwise, much of what all of the other panelists have so eloquently said should happen will inevitably happen. The government should do right by its people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oriam. Chloe?
Yeah, I think I would just like to use my minute to say thank you to all the survivors that I interviewed in Uganda, especially Nana and Chumia William for joining us today. William wasn't able to speak with us because of poor network, but we still appreciate his time. And I'd like to extend that gratitude to all of the survivors I interviewed for their time and commitment to human rights. I hope that their stories continue to bring awareness about the situation in Uganda, which will then be followed with concrete action as discussed by all the previous panelists that spoke before me.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I'll take this opportunity to thank everyone who contributed to this report. Chloe, who interviewed more than 25 people with really difficult stories. Joanne Goddard, Steve Metalitz, Andrea Barron, Seni O'Connor, all the survivors who provided their stories, all the citizen journalists in Uganda, everyone who is contributing to this webinar. Again, as I said, we have that report available on our website, but I can also share the link. I just shared the link with you. You can go and look at that report and share with others. Many organizations in Washington, D.C. and other places, we're working hard to make sure that accountability is, the next step for torture survivors. They need justice, they need compensation, they need a lot of things. But also the young people of Uganda deserve a country where they can express themselves, where they can contribute to the democracy of their country. So thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you in the near future. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.